A billionaire lost everything, until his cleaning lady did something that left the world shocked. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from right now. Drop your city and country in the comments below. It's incredible to see our Deep Stories family growing across the globe. If you believe that everyone deserves compassion when they're suffering, that kindness is never wasted even when offered to someone who doesn't seem to deserve it, and that we're never too broken to rebuild our lives, hit that subscribe button right now. This is Richard Morrison and Maria Santos' story, a tale of devastating loss, unexpected kindness, and discovering that sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you've been overlooking all along. Let's begin. Richard Morrison had built an empire on ruthless intelligence and complete disregard for anyone who couldn't help him accumulate more wealth and power. At 52, he was worth $3.7 billion, controlled one of the largest investment firms on Wall Street, and had a reputation for being the most cutthroat financier in Manhattan. People described him in business magazines as brilliant, strategic, visionary. People who actually knew him used different words: cold, calculating, merciless. Both assessments were accurate. Richard had sharp features that looked carved from granite, perfectly tailored $1,000 suits that announced his status before he said a word, and eyes that could dissect a balance sheet in seconds and destroy a competitor's confidence with a single glance. He was the kind of man who inspired fear and respect in equal measure, who commanded attention simply by entering a room, who had built his fortune by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone around him. Richard's penthouse overlooked Central Park from the 74th floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings. 22 rooms, 12,000 square feet, panoramic views of the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered through sheer will and strategic brilliance. Floor-to-ceiling windows, imported Italian marble, custom furniture that cost more than most people earned in a year. He lived alone in that massive space, having gone through 3 divorces by the time he turned 45, each ex-wife walking away with substantial settlements but zero regrets about leaving. His children from his second marriage barely spoke to him anymore, sending perfunctory texts on holidays and skipping family gatherings whenever possible. They lived on opposite coasts now, pursuing lives that had nothing to do with finance or their father. Every Tuesday and Friday, without fail, a cleaning service sent someone to maintain Richard's penthouse. The arrangement had been in place for 17 years, a simple monthly charge to his credit card that he never thought about or questioned. He had authorized automatic payment shortly after purchasing the apartment, and from that moment forward, the cleaning simply happened like magic. His home was always immaculate. Bathrooms sparkled, floors gleamed. Everything was perfectly organized. Richard never paid attention to how it happened or who made it happen. He left his credit card information on file with the service, authorized automatic payment for whatever they charged, and treated the cleaning staff like furniture that occasionally moved around his apartment, necessary but unworthy of actual attention or acknowledgement. For 15 of those 17 years, the same woman had been cleaning his home twice a week. Her name was Maria Santos. Richard had absolutely no idea. He'd never asked the name of anyone who cleaned his apartment. He'd never made conversation beyond brief instructions about specific tasks. He walked past whoever was cleaning his home without acknowledgement, sometimes talking on his phone as if they didn't exist, sometimes working on his laptop while they vacuumed around him. The people who cleaned his apartment were invisible to Richard in the most literal sense. He knew intellectually that someone was cleaning, but he never processed them as actual human beings with names and lives and thoughts. Maria would arrive at his building at 7:45 a.m. every Tuesday and Friday, take the service elevator to the 74th floor, let herself in with the key the cleaning company provided, and spend 6 hours making Richard's massive penthouse spotless. She cleaned bathrooms he never used, dusted rooms he never entered, organized closets full of clothes he'd forgotten he owned, polished silverware he'd purchased for entertaining. He never did. Richard was usually still asleep when she arrived, his bedroom door closed, soft sounds of classical music playing from speakers throughout the apartment. By the time he emerged around 10 a.m., Maria would have already cleaned half the penthouse. He would walk past her without a word, without eye contact, completely focused on his phone or the business news playing on the television, and disappear into his home office for hours of work. Maria was 63 years old when this story begins. She'd been cleaning houses in Manhattan for 37 years, ever since emigrating from El Salvador when she was 26, with nothing but determination and willingness to work harder than anyone around her. She had 2 adult children who'd both gone to college, both established successful careers, both offering repeatedly to support her so she could finally retire and rest after decades of physical labor. But Maria loved working. She took genuine pride in her work, found deep satisfaction in transforming messy spaces into organized beauty, and genuinely enjoyed many of her clients despite their tendency to treat her as invisible help rather than as a person. She had stories about each family she'd worked for over the years, observations about their lives that they would have been shocked to know she'd noticed. The wealthy family whose teenage daughter struggled with an eating disorder that the parents refused to acknowledge. The investment banker who drank scotch alone in his library every night, never knowing Maria could see his loneliness in how he positioned his chair to face the window instead of the empty room. The hedge fund manager whose wife was having an affair that he either didn't notice or chose to ignore. Maria had watched Richard Morrison for 15 years through the particular lens that invisible people use to observe those who don't see them. She'd noticed when his second wife left, based on the sudden absence of her belongings from the closet and the appearance of legal documents on the kitchen counter. She'd seen the gradual estrangement from his children through the progression of family photos in the living room, from recent pictures to increasingly outdated ones, to eventually the photos' quiet disappearance into storage boxes. She'd watched him become increasingly isolated despite his massive wealth and professional success. Observed how he never had friends over, how his only visitors were business associates who stayed for brief meetings in his home office. How he seemed to exist in this enormous apartment without any genuine human connection. Sometimes she felt sad for him. This brilliant man who seemed to have everything except anyone who genuinely cared about him or knew him as anything beyond Richard Morrison, the financial titan. She'd never expected him to notice her. In 15 years, he'd spoken perhaps 50 words directly to her, all of them instructions or brief responses to questions. That was normal in her experience. Most wealthy people treated domestic workers as invisible mechanisms rather than as human beings. Some were cruel about it, making demeaning comments or creating deliberately difficult conditions. But Richard wasn't cruel. He simply didn't see her at all, which, in Maria's long experience, was better than active cruelty. She could work in peace, do her job well, take satisfaction in maintaining this beautiful space, even if the person who lived here didn't acknowledge her existence. Then, in March of 2019, Richard Morrison's entire world exploded with devastating speed and completeness. It started with a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation into his firm's trading practices, routine at first, or so Richard assumed. His lawyers assured him it was standard regulatory procedure, nothing to worry about, easily manageable. Then the investigation expanded. Accounting irregularities emerged. Questions about securities fraud surfaced. Within 3 weeks, what had seemed like a minor regulatory inconvenience had transformed into a full-scale federal prosecution with criminal charges carrying potential prison sentences of 25 years. The media coverage was brutal and relentless. Richard Morrison, Wall Street titan, facing fraud charges. Richard Morrison, billionaire financier, under federal investigation. Richard Morrison, once celebrated as a genius investor, now accused of building his fortune through systematic criminal deception. Every business news outlet covered the story. Financial websites ran detailed analyses of his alleged crimes. Television reporters stood outside his building providing updates on the scandal. His photograph, usually accompanying profiles of his success, now illustrated articles about white-collar crime and regulatory failure. His legal defense cost him $140 million over the course of 14 months, the best attorney's money could buy, and they were worth every dollar in technical competence if not in actual outcome. The civil settlements required to resolve regulatory violations cost another $300 million. But the real devastation came when forensic accountants tore apart his finances during the legal proceedings and discovered what Richard himself hadn't fully understood, that most of his wealth existed only on paper, leveraged against assets that were themselves borrowed against other obligations in complex financial structures that looked impressive until someone examined them carefully. When they liquidated everything to pay settlements, legal fees, and satisfy regulatory requirements, Richard Morrison walked away with $4 million from a $3.7 billion empire. 99.9% of his net worth simply evaporated, revealed as elaborate financial architecture built on foundations that couldn't support actual scrutiny. But the financial losses, devastating as they were, weren't the worst part. The worst part was the complete and total social annihilation that followed the scandal. Friends who'd attended his dinner parties and laughed at his jokes suddenly couldn't return his phone calls. Business associates who'd sought his advice and partnership now claimed they'd never known him well, had only worked with him because of professional obligation, had always had private concerns about his methods. The charity boards he'd served on quietly removed his name from their materials and returned his donations to avoid association with scandal. His country club revoked his membership. His name disappeared from buildings he'd funded. People who'd competed for his attention now crossed the street to avoid acknowledging him. His children, both in their early 20s by this point, changed their last names to their mother's maiden name and refused to speak to him. His daughter sent a brief email explaining that they couldn't be associated with him anymore, that the scandal had damaged their reputations and career prospects, that they needed distance for their own well-being. They blocked his number. When he tried to reach out through their mother, she forwarded a message from their attorneys demanding he cease all contact. The federal prosecution ultimately fell apart on procedural technicalities related to how evidence had been gathered. The charges were dismissed with prejudice, meaning Richard avoided prison entirely. His lawyers celebrated this outcome as a major victory. Richard felt nothing. Yes, he'd avoided incarceration, but in every way that mattered socially, professionally, and personally, his life was completely over. He was 54 years old, had $4 million remaining from a multi-billion-dollar fortune, and absolutely no idea who he was if he wasn't Richard Morrison, Wall Street titan, financial genius, billionaire philanthropist. The cleaning service called him in April to inform him they'd no longer be servicing his account. They were professional about it, simply explaining that they were restructuring their client list and his property would no longer fit their service area. Richard understood what that really meant. They didn't want the association with his scandal. He thanked them politely and hung up, then looked around his massive penthouse and thought about how absurd it was that he'd lose his cleaning service before losing his home. He sold the Central Park penthouse in June for $43 million, which was less than half what he'd paid for it, but represented a quick sale to a buyer who wasn't bothered by purchasing a scandal-tainted property at a significant discount. Richard moved into a small two-bedroom apartment in Queens, the kind of neighborhood he'd never visited in his entire 30 years of living in New York, despite it being only a few miles from Manhattan. The apartment cost $1,200 a month and had paint peeling in the bathroom and windows that didn't quite seal properly. After the sale closed and fees were paid, Richard had about $4,700,000 in liquid assets, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life if he was careful. But such a dramatic drop from his former wealth that he sometimes woke up thinking the last year had been a nightmare. Depression settled over Richard like a heavy wet blanket he couldn't shake off. Days blurred into each other without distinction or purpose. He stopped shaving regularly, stopped changing clothes unless they actually smelled bad, stopped caring about anything beyond basic survival. He'd wake up in the afternoon, sometimes as late as 3 or 4 p.m. hours, and stare at the ceiling of his small Queens bedroom, trying to remember why he should bother getting out of bed. Sometimes he'd spend entire days on the couch watching news he didn't care about, seeing the world continue without him while he existed in this strange, frozen state of nothing. The $4 million meant he didn't have to work, which initially seemed like a blessing but turned out to be a curse. Without the necessity of employment, he had no structure to his days, no obligations to force him into regular patterns, no reason to shower or dress or interact with other humans. And even if he'd wanted to work, he couldn't imagine anyone hiring him anyway. His name was professionally toxic. Every Google search returned articles about his scandal. No company would risk the association, and Richard had no skills beyond financial manipulation in an industry that had completely blacklisted him. He had no friends to call. The people he'd considered friends had all proven to be professional acquaintances who disappeared the moment association with him became liability. He had no family who would speak to him. His children had cut him off completely. His ex-wives certainly weren't going to provide emotional support. He existed alone in his small apartment, disconnected from every social structure that had previously defined his life, with nothing but time to think about how thoroughly he'd wasted 54 years building a life that collapsed the moment it was actually tested. 3 months into this new existence, Richard started seriously considering suicide. Not in a dramatic, emotional way, but in the practical, logical manner he'd always approached problems. He made lists of methods, researched their effectiveness, thought through logistics. He had no purpose. No connections to other humans, no reason he could identify for continuing to exist. His life had ended in every meaningful sense except the technical biological one. Why not just finish it cleanly and efficiently? He didn't actually do it, but not because he had hope or saw possibility for improvement. He simply couldn't muster the energy to follow through. Existing was barely manageable. Actively ending his existence seemed like too much effort. So he continued in his strange half-life of depression, going through minimal motions of basic survival, day after day after day, waiting for nothing in particular. And then, on a Tuesday morning in September, 3 months after moving into the Queen's apartment, there was a knock on Richard's door. He wasn't expecting anyone, hadn't ordered anything, wasn't scheduled for any building maintenance. He considered ignoring it, pretending he wasn't home, going back to the couch where he'd been sitting motionless for 2 hours. But the knock came again, gentle and persistent. And Richard sighed and got up and opened the door. Maria Santos stood in the hallway, wearing simple cleaning clothes and carrying a small bag of cleaning supplies. "Hello, Mr. Morrison," she said in her gentle, slightly accented English. "I heard you moved to this neighborhood. I thought maybe you need someone to clean your apartment." Richard stared at her, confused. He vaguely recognized her as someone he'd seen before, though he couldn't place from where. The cleaning lady from the service. Maybe? He wasn't sure. "I can't pay you," he said dully. "The courts froze most of my accessible money. I can barely afford food." "I'm not asking for payment," Maria said quietly. "You've been my client for 15 years. You always paid on time through the service, never complained about my work. Now you're having hard times. I want to help." 15 years. Richard's confusion deepened. "You've been cleaning my apartment for 15 years? Maria nodded. "Every Tuesday and Friday since 2004. You never knew my name, which is okay. I'm Maria Santos." Richard felt something strange happening in his chest, some emotion he couldn't identify. "Why would you want to help me? I barely acknowledged your existence for 15 years. I never even asked your name. I don't think I said more than 10 words directly to you in all that time. I treated you like furniture." Maria smiled, and it was the kind of smile that held both sadness and deep wisdom earned through decades of careful observation. "Mr. Morrison, I've been cleaning houses for 37 years. I've worked for many wealthy people, probably 100 different families over the decades. Most of them treat me exactly like you did, like I'm invisible, Like I'm a robot that vacuums and dusts and doesn't have thoughts or feelings or a life beyond servicing their homes. You weren't special in that way. You weren't unusually cruel or unusually kind. You were typical. You ignored me, yes. But there are much worse things than being ignored. Some clients were actively cruel. You never were. You paid fairly through the company, never disputed charges, never blamed me when something broke, never touched me inappropriately or said racist things like some clients did. You simply didn't see me as a person, which is very normal in my work. I made peace with that invisibility a long time ago. She paused, her expression softening with genuine compassion. But now you're suffering. I can see it in how you answered the door, in how you're living. And I don't need to have been your friend to recognize that you're in real pain and to want to help ease that pain a little bit. You're a human being who's struggling. I'm a human being who has the ability to help. That's enough reason. Richard felt that strange sensation in his chest intensify. It took him a moment to recognize it as the feeling of something hard and protective cracking open. I don't deserve your help, he said, and his voice broke on the words. I don't deserve anyone's help. I was arrogant and ruthless, and I treated people like they were disposable tools for my success. Everything that happened to me, I earned through my own choices. I built an empire on not caring about anyone except myself. Why would you help someone like that? Maybe you earned some of what happened, Maria said gently. Maybe you didn't. I don't know enough about your business or your legal troubles to judge. I just clean houses. I can't say if you deserve to lose your money or your career. But I do know this, and I know it from my own faith and my own life experience. Everyone deserves compassion when they're suffering. No matter what they did before, no matter how they treated other people, pain is pain. Suffering is suffering. And if I have the ability to ease someone's suffering even a little bit, then I should do it. That's what being human means. That's what loving your neighbor means. Even when your neighbor spent 15 years treating you as invisible. She looked directly into his eyes with a steadiness that made Richard feel seen in a way he couldn't remember experiencing before. Let me help you. Mr. Morrison, let me clean your apartment and make sure you're eating properly and maybe help you find your way back to being a person instead of just existing in pain. You don't have to deserve it. You just have to let me do it. Richard Morrison started crying. Not just a few tears, but real sobbing, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and unprotected. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried. Probably not since childhood. Definitely not in his adult life. But standing in his doorway facing this woman he'd ignored for 15 years. This woman who had every reason to walk past his suffering the way he'd walked past her humanity, Richard broke. All the grief and shame and terror he'd been holding in for months came pouring out in heaving sobs he couldn't control. Maria stepped forward without hesitation and put her arms around him. This woman he'd treated as invisible furniture, this woman whose name he'd never bothered learning in 15 years, held him while he cried like a child. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder, but her presence felt solid and steady in a way nothing else in Richard's life had felt for months. She held him and made soft, comforting sounds, and didn't seem bothered by his tears soaking into her shoulder. When Richard finally stopped crying, embarrassed and exhausted, Maria guided him to his couch and went to his tiny kitchen. She opened his refrigerator and made a small sound of dismay at what she found there, which was basically nothing except some old takeout containers and a half-empty bottle of vodka. She opened cabinets and found them similarly bare. Mr. Morrison, when did you last eat a real meal? She asked. Richard couldn't remember. Days ago? Maybe longer? I'm not hungry, he said, which was true. He'd lost his appetite months earlier along with everything else. Hunger isn't always about appetite, Maria said firmly. Your body needs food whether you want it or not. I'm going to the grocery store. I'll be back in an hour. You don't need to do that, Richard protested weakly. I know I don't need to, Maria said with a small smile. I want to rest. I'll be back soon. She left, and Richard sat on his couch feeling strange and unbalanced. Part of him wanted to lock the door and not let her back in, to protect himself from this confusing situation where someone showed him kindness he didn't understand or deserve. But a larger part of him desperately didn't want to be alone anymore. Wanted someone to care if he ate or not. Wanted this woman's steady, compassionate presence, even though he had no idea how to process it. Maria returned an hour later with grocery bags. She put away food, then made him a simple meal of chicken and rice and vegetables. She sat with him while he ate, not pressuring him to talk, just being present in a calm way that somehow made the silence comfortable instead of oppressive. I'll come 3 times a week, she told him when he finished eating. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. I'll clean and make sure you have food and help however I can. You don't pay me anything. This is what I choose to do. Why? Richard asked again, still unable to understand. You have your own life, your own family. Why would you spend time helping someone who treated you terribly for 15 years? Maria thought for a moment before answering. When I came to America from El Salvador, I was 26 years old with 2 small children and no English and no money. Everything was hard. Finding work, finding housing, understanding how anything worked in this country. Many people treated me badly because I was an immigrant who didn't speak good English. They assumed I was stupid or lazy or criminal, but some people helped me, not because I deserved it or because I could pay them back. They helped because they saw I needed help and they had the ability to give it. Those people saved my life in important ways. Now I can be that person for someone else. I can see you need help, and I have the ability to give it. That's enough reason, Mr. Morrison. Please call me Richard, he said quietly. I don't deserve formality from you. Maria smiled. Okay, Richard. And you can call me Maria. That was the beginning of Richard Morrison's salvation, though he didn't know it yet. The beginning of a transformation more profound than anything he'd experienced in his previous 54 years. The beginning of understanding that the person he'd been was dead, and someone entirely different might be possible. Maria came 3 times a week to Richard's small apartment, refusing to accept any payment despite his repeated offers once he regained access to his funds. But she did more than clean. She became the structure around which Richard began to rebuild some kind of functional existence. She made sure he had groceries, real food, instead of takeout. She cooked simple meals and left them in his refrigerator with notes about how to reheat them. She opened his curtains to let sunlight into the apartment. She gently insisted he shower and put on clean clothes before she arrived. She brought him books from the library, partly because she thought he needed something to occupy his mind beyond television news, partly because she herself loved reading and wanted to share that with him. And she talked to him. Maria had a remarkable gift for conversation, for finding interest and meaning in small, ordinary moments. She talked about her own life freely, her children and their families, her experiences immigrating to America and learning to navigate a completely foreign culture, the various families she'd worked for over decades, and the insights she'd gained about human nature from observing wealthy people in their private spaces. She had a way of finding humor and humanity in daily experiences, of seeing beauty in things Richard had never noticed or valued. The way morning light came through a window, the satisfaction of a well-organized closet, the pleasure of a properly cooked meal shared with another person. At first, Richard barely responded. He listened because her voice was better than silence, but he didn't have energy for real conversation. But Maria was patient. She didn't require him to perform or to be anything other than a person struggling through difficult circumstances. Gradually, very gradually, over weeks and then months, Richard started talking back. First just brief responses to her questions, then longer answers when she asked about his background or his former career. Then, eventually, real discussions about everything from politics to philosophy to the strange experience of losing everything that had previously defined who you were as a person. One Tuesday morning, about 6 weeks after Maria had first knocked on his door, Richard was actually dressed and showered when she arrived, waiting for her with coffee made. Maria smiled when she saw this small evidence that he was starting to care again about basic self-maintenance. "I still don't understand why you're doing this for me," Richard said as they sat together drinking coffee before Maria started cleaning. "I've been thinking about it constantly. You spent 15 years being invisible to me. Why would you help me now?" Maria set down her coffee cup and looked at him with that steady, compassionate gaze. "Because everyone needs someone who sees them as human. Richard, for 54 years, you were Richard Morrison, the successful businessman. That identity was so strong, so all-consuming, that it's all anyone ever saw when they looked at you. Your employees saw their boss. Your clients saw an investment genius. Your ex-wives saw a wealthy provider. Your children saw a father who was always working. Everyone saw what you could do for them or what you represented. Nobody saw you as just a human being with needs and feelings and struggles. Now all of that is gone. The businessman identity was taken away, and you have a chance to discover who Richard Morrison, the human being, actually is underneath all that performance. That's why I'm helping. Because everyone deserves someone who sees their humanity, especially when they've lost everything else." Richard felt tears starting again, but blinked them back. "But I treated you as invisible. I never saw your humanity." "I know," Maria said simply. "And it wasn't kind. But do you know what I learned from cleaning houses for wealthy people for 37 years? That most people are so wrapped up in their own performance, their own identity, their own struggles, that they don't have energy left to actually see other people clearly. You weren't cruel. You weren't deliberately hateful. You were just focused on things that seemed important to you at the time. And now you have a chance to learn what actually matters. What actually makes a life worth living." "What actually matters?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. Maria gestured around his small apartment. "Not this. Not money or status or impressing people who don't actually care about you beyond what you can do for them. What matters is connection, real human connection, seeing other people as complete humans and being seen as human yourself. Kindness offered and kindness received. Making someone's day better just by being in it. Learning someone's actual name and asking about their life. Helping someone who needs help because you can, not because it benefits you. That's what lasts, Richard. That's what makes a life rich. Not dollars in a bank account, but moments of genuine human connection." Richard absorbed this, thinking about his previous life. How many people's names had he never learned? How many times had he walked past human suffering without seeing it because he was too focused on his next deal? How much richness had he missed by measuring everything in terms of financial value or professional utility? "Can someone learn that?" he asked. "Connection, kindness, seeing people, or is it too late for me?" "It's never too late," Maria said firmly. "You're 54. If you're lucky, you have 30 more years to live. You can spend those years becoming someone completely different, someone better, someone who makes the world better just by being in it. But it requires actually changing, Richard. Not just feeling bad about who you were. Actual transformation of how you think and how you treat people and what you value." "How do I do that?" Richard asked. And he meant it genuinely, desperately wanting to understand this thing that had completely eluded him for his entire life. "Start small," Maria said. "Start by learning the names of people you interact with. The person who delivers your mail. The person at the grocery store checkout. Start by looking at them, really looking, and seeing them as complete humans with lives as complex as yours. Start by asking how they are and actually listening to the answer. Start by doing kind things, not because it benefits you, but because kindness makes the world better. Start by practicing empathy, putting yourself in other people's positions, imagining their struggles. It's like learning a language, Richard. At first it feels awkward and forced, but if you practice consistently, it becomes natural. You can become fluent in kindness and connection if you work at it. Over the following weeks and months, something remarkable happened. Richard Morrison started to heal. Not quickly, and not without setbacks and difficult days, but genuinely heal from the inside out. Maria's consistent presence and patient guidance gave him something he'd never had before. Unconditional human connection, not based on what he could provide or accomplish, but simply on his existence as a human being. The healing wasn't linear. There were terrible days when Richard couldn't get out of bed, when the depression felt as heavy and suffocating as it had been before Maria arrived, days when he couldn't see the point of trying, when the weight of everything he'd lost and everything he'd done wrong crushed him completely. On those days, Maria would sit beside his bed and simply be present. She didn't try to fix him with cheerful platitudes or motivational speeches. She just sat there, sometimes holding his hand, sometimes reading aloud from books she thought he might enjoy, sometimes just existing in the room with him so he wasn't alone with his darkness. "I don't deserve your patience," Richard told her on one particularly bad day when he'd been in bed for 30 hours straight. "You should give up on me. I'm not worth this effort." Maria looked at him with that steady, compassionate gaze that had become so familiar. "Richard," she said gently, "worth isn't something you earn or lose based on your circumstances or your mental health. You're a human being. That makes you worthy of compassion and care. Period. No conditions, no requirements. You exist. Therefore you matter. That's how it works. But I've wasted so much of my life," Richard said, his voice breaking. 54 years of being the wrong person. 54 years of hurting people and missing what mattered. How do I forgive myself for that? "You start by accepting that the person you were and the person you're becoming are not the same," Maria replied. The old Richard made choices based on what he'd been taught to value and what he thought would make him successful and happy. Those choices hurt people, yes, but that person is gone now. Everything that defined him was stripped away. Now you get to choose who you want to be going forward. You can't change the past. You can only decide who to be in each present moment. And in this present moment, you're choosing to acknowledge your failures and work toward being better. That's enough for today. Tomorrow you can make the same choice again. And the day after that, each day, each moment, choosing to be different than you were. Richard absorbed this, finding comfort in the idea that transformation could happen incrementally, moment by moment, rather than requiring some impossible dramatic metamorphosis. He didn't have to become perfect. He just had to try to be slightly better, slightly kinder, slightly more aware each day. The church community became increasingly important to Richard's healing. At first, attending services and community gatherings was overwhelming. He wasn't religious, had never been religious, didn't know the rituals or the hymns or the rhythms of church community life, but the people were so welcoming, so genuinely happy to include him, that his discomfort gradually eased. They taught him the responses during services, shared their hymnals, invited him to sit with their families. They asked about his week and listened to his answers. They shared their own struggles and joys. They treated him like he belonged, even when he felt like a complete outsider. Maria introduced him to her church community, a small congregation of mostly immigrants from Central America who met in a modest building in Queens. Richard was terrified the first time he attended, convinced they would recognize him from news coverage of his scandal, judge him, reject him. But Maria had prepared the community, explaining that she was bringing a friend who was struggling, asking them to welcome him with kindness. They did. They welcomed Richard Morrison, former billionaire disgraced financier, as just Richard, Maria's friend who needed community. They shook his hand and learned his name and invited him to coffee hour and asked genuine questions about his life. No one cared that he'd been wealthy or that he'd lost everything. Several of them had immigrated from war zones with literally nothing, had built lives from complete zero, understood that circumstances could change overnight and identity could be stripped away. They accepted Richard with a matter-of-fact compassion that moved him deeply. For the first time in his life, he was part of a community where his value wasn't tied to his accomplishments or his status. He was just Richard, just a person, just a human being worthy of kindness and connection, because all human beings were worthy of those things. Maria introduced him to her church community, a small congregation of mostly immigrants from Central America who met in a modest building in Queens. Richard was terrified the first time he attended, convinced they would recognize him from news coverage of his scandal, judge him, reject him. But Maria had prepared the community, explaining that she was bringing a friend who was struggling, asking them to welcome him with kindness. They did. They welcomed Richard Morrison, former billionaire disgraced financier, as just Richard, Maria's friend who needed community. They shook his hand warmly and learned his name and invited him to coffee hour afterward and asked genuine questions about his life with interest that seemed completely sincere. No one cared that he'd been wealthy. No one cared that he'd lost everything. Several of them had immigrated from war zones with literally nothing, had built lives from complete zero in a country where they didn't speak the language or understand the culture, understood intimately that circumstances could change overnight and that identity could be stripped away by forces beyond your control. They accepted Richard with a matter-of-fact compassion that moved him profoundly. For the first time in his adult life, he was part of a community where his value wasn't tied to his accomplishments or his status or what he could provide to others. He was just Richard, just a person, just a human being worthy of kindness and connection, simply because all human beings were inherently worthy of those things. He started volunteering at the church's food bank, which operated every Saturday morning distributing groceries to families in need. At first, he just did basic tasks that required no particular expertise, carrying boxes from delivery trucks, organizing shelves, helping families load their groceries into their cars. The work was physical and straightforward, requiring his presence and effort, but nothing more. Richard found it oddly satisfying. For 54 years, his work had been entirely cerebral, manipulating numbers and analyzing markets and structuring deals. Using his body to do simple physical labor felt grounding in a way he hadn't expected. But then the food bank coordinator, an energetic woman named Carmen, who'd immigrated from Honduras 20 years earlier, discovered Richard's background in finance and asked if he could help them understand their budget and optimize their purchasing. The food bank had been operating on donated funds and volunteer labor for 8 years, serving about 300 families per month. But they struggled constantly with money, never quite sure if they'd be able to afford enough food to meet demand, making difficult decisions about what to buy and what to skip each week. Richard spent a weekend analyzing their spending patterns, researching wholesale food suppliers, comparing costs across different vendors, reorganizing their entire procurement process. He discovered they were paying retail prices for many items when wholesale options were available at significant discounts. He found grant programs they qualified for but had never applied to. He restructured their purchasing schedule to take advantage of seasonal price variations. He negotiated better rates with their current suppliers by committing to larger regular orders. The result? He saved the food bank approximately 32% of their operating costs, which meant they could serve significantly more families with the same budget, or provide more groceries to the families they already served, or both. It felt good. Not the superficial good of closing a profitable multi-million-dollar deal, but a deep, satisfying good that settled into his bones and made him feel like maybe his existence had actual purpose. He'd used his skills to genuinely help people, to make real, tangible difference in how many families would eat well that month. Carmen cried when he presented the new budget and explained what it would enable them to do. She actually cried, tears of gratitude and relief, then hugged him tightly, thanking him over and over for making it possible to serve 200 additional families each month. Richard couldn't remember the last time anyone had hugged him out of genuine gratitude rather than social obligation or professional courtesy. Maybe never in his entire life. Word spread in the community that Richard was good with finances and willing to help for free. People started approaching him with questions after church services, tentatively at first, worried about bothering him, but increasingly comfortable as he proved genuinely interested and helpful. Could he explain this credit report that seemed full of errors? Could he help them understand why their checking account kept getting overdraft fees? Could he look at this medical bill that seemed impossibly high and help them figure out if it was correct? Could he advise them about whether bankruptcy was their only option or if other solutions existed? Word spread in the community that Richard was good with finances and willing to help. People started approaching him with questions: how to understand their credit reports, how to budget on an irregular income, how to navigate bankruptcy or negotiate with creditors or avoid predatory lenders. Richard discovered he was genuinely good at explaining complex financial concepts in simple terms, at helping people who'd been excluded from financial literacy develop practical strategies for managing money. He started offering free financial counseling 2 evenings a week at the church, seeing anyone who wanted help. He helped a young couple understand the mortgage process and avoid exploitative lending. He helped an older woman negotiate down her medical debt from $50,000 to $12,000 through appeals and payment arrangements she didn't know existed. He helped a small business owner reorganize his finances to avoid bankruptcy and actually achieve profitability. None of it was glamorous work. None of it appeared in business publications or earned him recognition beyond thank-you hugs and handwritten cards. But it was meaningful in ways his Wall Street career had never been. He was actually helping people, seeing direct positive impact from his efforts, making real differences in individual lives. His friendship with Maria deepened into something profound. She became the closest friend he'd ever had, closer than any of his Wall Street associates had been. Those relationships, he now understood, had all been transactional, based on mutual benefit and strategic alliance. His friendship with Maria was different. It was based on genuine care and mutual respect and actual knowledge of each other as complete humans. They had dinner together twice a week, usually at modest restaurants in Queens where the food was good and authentic and cheap. She introduced him to Salvadoran cuisine, pupusas, and yuca con chicharrón, foods he'd never experienced in all his years living in Manhattan. He introduced her to literature he loved, lending her books and discussing them afterward, delighting in her insights and perspectives. Maria's children, both in their 30s now with families of their own, were initially suspicious of this wealthy white man who'd treated their mother as invisible for 15 years, but who now claimed to be her friend. They couldn't understand why their mother would help someone who'd completely ignored her existence. But Maria was patient with their concerns, explaining her philosophy of compassion and second chances. Gradually, as they saw how Richard had genuinely changed, how he treated their mother with deep respect and affection, how he'd become part of the church community and was actively helping people, they accepted him. Not enthusiastically at first, but eventually with genuine warmth. Richard learned Spanish, partly to communicate better with the church community, partly as a gift to Maria to honor her culture and her language. He studied with typical intensity, the same focus he'd once applied to financial markets now directed toward conjugating verbs and mastering pronunciation. Maria was delighted. She gently corrected his mistakes, laughed affectionately when he mixed up words, praised his progress. Her daughter, who taught ESL, gave him lessons and practice materials. Within a year, Richard was conversational. Not fluent, but capable of real communication, able to counsel his financial clients in Spanish when needed. One evening, about 18 months after Maria had first knocked on his Queens apartment door, they were having dinner at a small Salvadoran restaurant. When Richard said, "I need to tell you something I've been thinking about," Maria looked up from her meal, curious and attentive. "I've been thinking about what to do with the rest of my life." Richard continued, "Not just day to day, but bigger purpose. I still have about $3 million left after paying for my apartment and covering living expenses. It's more than I need for the rest of my life if I'm careful. I want to use it to start a foundation to help people like the ones we've been working with at the church." People dealing with medical debt they don't understand. Immigrant families navigating complex legal systems. People in financial crisis who need advocacy and education. I want to create something that actually makes a meaningful difference instead of just making wealthy people wealthier. That sounds wonderful, Maria said warmly. What would you call it? Richard paused, then said carefully, The Santos Foundation. Named after you. Because you saved my life, Maria. I was drowning in depression and shame and isolation. You threw me a lifeline even though I'd done absolutely nothing to deserve it. Everything good that's happened to me in the last 18 months came from your compassion, your willingness to see my humanity when I'd never seen yours. I want to honor that. Maria's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Morrison, Richard, you don't need to do that. You don't need to name anything after me. I know I don't need to, Richard said gently. I want to, and more than that, I need you to help me run it. You understand these communities in ways I never could. You know what people actually need, not what wealthy donors think they need or what looks good in a mission statement. You've built relationships and trust over decades. Will you help me build this foundation together? Maria reached across the table and took his hand, her small, weathered hand holding his larger one. Yes, she said softly. I will help you, but on one condition. Anything, Richard said, that we do this as true partners. Not you as the wealthy founder and me as the helper. True equal partners who make decisions together and build something that represents both of our perspectives and values. Can you do that? Richard felt his eyes stinging. For 54 years, he'd operated as the sole decision-maker, the ultimate authority, the person whose vision and intelligence determined everything. The idea of truly equal partnership was completely foreign to his experience, and absolutely necessary if he was going to be different than who he'd been. Yes, he said, equal partners. I have money and financial expertise. You have wisdom and community knowledge and relationships built over decades. We're both essential. We decide everything together. Maria smiled through her tears. Then yes, let's build the Santos Foundation together. They spent months planning before officially launching the foundation. Richard wanted to do it right, not just throw money at problems, but create sustainable programs with measurable impact. They researched effective approaches to the issues they wanted to address. They consulted with people doing similar work in other cities. They brought together advisory boards of people from the communities they wanted to serve, ensuring their programs would actually meet real needs rather than imported assumptions. The Foundation's first major program focused on medical debt negotiation. They hired social workers who would meet with families drowning in medical bills, review their cases, and negotiate with hospitals and collection agencies on their behalf. The results were remarkable. Most hospitals had financial assistance programs that few patients knew existed. Most medical bills could be negotiated down significantly if someone knew the right approaches and was persistent. The Foundation's advocates helped reduce medical debt by an average of 72%. Transforming situations that felt hopeless into manageable payment plans. They helped 60 families in the first year alone, preventing bankruptcies and alleviating crushing stress. Their second program provided free immigration legal services in partnership with pro bono attorneys. Navigating the immigration system required expertise most families couldn't afford. The Foundation connected immigrant families with qualified attorneys and covered all associated costs. They helped 48 families in the first year, including 12 who achieved permanent legal status they'd been seeking for years. Their third program offered financial literacy education and microloans for small business development. Maria had observed for years how many immigrants in her community had business skills and ideas, but lacked access to capital and understanding of American business systems. The Foundation provided education about business planning, accounting, tax obligations, then offered small loans with counseling support to increase success rates. 12 new businesses launched in the first year, all still operating profitably after 18 months. Richard's former life became increasingly distant and irrelevant. He lived simply in his Queens apartment, finding he genuinely preferred it to his old Central Park penthouse. He wore regular clothes from normal stores instead of custom suits that cost thousands of dollars. He took the subway instead of hiring cars. He had meaningful friendships based on genuine connection instead of transactional business relationships. He belonged to a community that knew him as Richard, who volunteers at the food bank, not Richard Morrison, the disgraced billionaire. His children remained distant. That hurt, a persistent ache he'd learned to carry. He'd written them letters explaining his transformation, apologizing for his failures as a father, asking for nothing but expressing hope they might someday be willing to know who he'd become. They hadn't responded. Richard understood. He'd damaged those relationships possibly beyond repair. All he could do was become a better person and hope that someday they might see that change and decide to give him a chance. But he couldn't force it. Their healing would happen on their timeline, if it happened at all. 3 years after the foundation started, a reporter from the New York Times reached out. They were doing a feature piece on innovative approaches to poverty alleviation and had heard about the Santos Foundation's unusually high success rate in reducing medical debt and supporting immigrant families. They wanted to interview Richard and Maria about their methods. Richard's first instinct was to decline. He had no desire to return to public attention, but Maria convinced him to participate, arguing that publicity might help other organizations adopt their approaches and might attract funding to expand their programs. Reluctantly, Richard agreed. The reporter spent a day with them, observing their work, interviewing clients whose lives had been changed by foundation programs, talking to volunteers and staff. The resulting article was published in early 2023 under the headline, "The Billionaire Who Lost Everything and Found What Matters: How Richard Morrison and Maria Santos Are Redefining Philanthropy." The article told their story in detail. 15 years of Richard treating Maria as invisible, his catastrophic fall, Maria's unexpected compassion, their unlikely partnership, the foundation they'd built together. The reporter had clearly done extensive research, including interviews with people from both Richard's former life and his current community. The contrast was stark. Former colleagues described him as brilliant but ruthless, completely focused on profit, dismissive of anyone who couldn't help him succeed. Current community members described him as kind, genuinely helpful, humble, always willing to listen and learn. The article went viral. Within 48 hours, it had been shared over 2 million times across social media platforms. Other news outlets picked up the story. National television programs requested interviews. The foundation's website crashed from traffic as tens of thousands of people tried to learn more or make donations. Richard and Maria were both uncomfortable with the attention. They were private people who'd never sought spotlight or recognition. But they also recognized that the attention served purposes beyond their personal discomfort. Every interview was an opportunity to talk about the issues that mattered to them, the way society systematically undervalued service workers and people in low-wage jobs, the crisis of medical debt destroying American families, the possibility of genuine transformation and redemption after catastrophic failure, the importance of seeing every person's fundamental humanity regardless of their position in social hierarchies, the power of simple kindness to change lives. They agreed to interviews selectively, always trying to redirect attention from themselves to the broader problems their story illustrated. They appeared on morning shows and podcasts and news programs, always emphasizing that their personal narrative was less important than the systemic issues they were working to address. One particularly impactful appearance was on a national morning show where the host asked Richard a question he'd been dreading. "Mr. Morrison, some critics have said that you only helped Maria and started this foundation because you wanted positive publicity to rehabilitate your image after your scandal. How do you respond to that?" Richard took a breath before answering, knowing this moment mattered. I understand completely why people might think that. I can't prove them wrong. I can only tell you what actually happened. When Maria showed up at my apartment in Queens, I had nothing. My career was over. My reputation was destroyed. My family had disowned me. I wasn't thinking about public image or rehabilitation. I was barely thinking at all. I was deeply depressed, isolated, and seriously considering suicide. Maria helped me when I was nobody, when I had no power or influence or fame, when helping me gained her absolutely nothing and might have seemed foolish or naive to people who knew how I'd treated her. Everything that's happened since, the foundation and the publicity and this conversation we're having right now, all of it came from her compassion offered to someone who didn't deserve it. I didn't help Maria. She helped me. She saved my life. The foundation is my attempt to honor that gift by passing it forward to others. Maria, sitting beside him, added, and I want to be very clear about something. I didn't help Richard because I thought he would start a foundation or become a better person or do anything to repay me. I helped him because he was suffering, and I had the ability to ease that suffering a little bit. What he chose to do with that help was completely up to him. I would have been just as satisfied if he'd simply become a person who was less miserable, who found some peace, who learned to connect with other humans. The foundation is wonderful, yes, but it wasn't the goal. The goal was helping another human being survive a terrible time. That's always been my goal. That's what compassion means. The interview clip was shared millions of times. People responded to the authenticity, the clear, genuine emotion in both Richard's and Maria's responses, the obvious depth of their partnership and friendship. Donations flooded into the Santos Foundation. Within 3 months, they'd received over $4 million in contributions from people moved by their story. Richard and Maria were careful with this influx of resources. They didn't rush to expand. They hired slowly and deliberately, bringing on people who shared their values and understood the communities they served. They opened chapters in 2 additional cities, replicating their successful program models with local adaptations. By its 5th anniversary, the Santos Foundation had helped over 10,000 families negotiate medical debt, assisted 800 immigrant families with legal services, and funded 400 small business startups, 92% of which were still operating profitably. The foundation had a staff of 38, an endowment of $18 million, and programs in 5 cities. Richard and Maria ran it together as true equal partners. They made all major decisions jointly, brought different but complementary perspectives to every challenge, challenged each other while maintaining deep mutual respect. Their partnership worked precisely because they were so different. Richard brought strategic thinking and financial expertise. Maria brought community knowledge and relationships built over decades. Together they created something neither could have built alone. Richard's children eventually reached out, 6 years after they'd cut off contact. His daughter sent a careful email explaining that they'd seen the Times article and the subsequent media coverage, had been following the foundation's work, had talked to former clients who spoke movingly about how the foundation had helped them. She wrote, "I'm not ready to have you back in my life fully. You hurt us badly, and that pain doesn't disappear just because you've changed. But I'm willing to start slowly, maybe coffee sometime, just to talk. No promises beyond that." Richard cried when he read the email. He replied immediately, "Thank you for being willing to try. I understand completely that I damaged our relationship, possibly beyond repair. I take full responsibility for that damage. I'm grateful for any chance to know you, even just a little bit. Coffee sounds perfect. Whenever works for you. I'll be there." They met 3 weeks later at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, neutral territory. It was awkward at first. His daughter, Jennifer, was 31 now, a successful marketing executive, married with a young daughter Richard had never met. They were essentially strangers who happened to share DNA and a painful history. But they talked, carefully at first, about neutral topics, then, gradually, about harder things, the divorce, Richard's neglect when she was growing up, the scandal and how it affected her life, Richard didn't make excuses. He apologized sincerely, acknowledged his failures, explained how he'd changed without trying to justify who he'd been. Jennifer listened. At the end, she said, "I don't know if I can forgive you fully, but I can see you're different. The person you've become is someone I might want to know. This is going to take time." "I understand," Richard said. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." They started meeting monthly for coffee. Jennifer introduced Richard to her husband and, eventually, to their daughter, Richard's granddaughter. The relationship rebuilt slowly, never quite recapturing what they'd lost, but creating something new. Something based on who they were now, rather than who they'd been before. Richard treasured every moment, grateful for a connection he'd thought was gone forever. His son, Michael, reached out a year later. Their reconciliation followed a similar pattern: slow, careful, honest about past damage, focused on building something new rather than recapturing what was lost. Michael brought his boyfriend to dinner with Richard and Maria, a significant gesture of trust. They talked about Michael's work as an environmental lawyer, Richard's foundation work, their mutual surprise at how their lives had evolved. Richard lived another 21 years after Maria first knocked on his Queens apartment door. He died at 77, surrounded by Maria and her family, his daughter and son and their families, foundation staff and volunteers and clients, church community members. The small hospital room was crowded with people whose lives he'd touched, people who genuinely loved him not for what he'd accomplished in his first 54 years, but for who he'd become in his final 23. His funeral was held at the church in Queens. Hundreds of people attended. The eulogies didn't talk much about his Wall Street career or his billions or his former status. They talked about Richard, who taught financial literacy classes every Tuesday evening. Richard, who helped negotiate medical bills and prevented bankruptcies. Richard, who learned Spanish to better serve his community. Richard, who showed up consistently, who listened carefully, who treated everyone with genuine respect regardless of their status or position. Richard, who proved that transformation was possible, that someone could fundamentally change, that it was never too late to become a better person. Maria gave the final eulogy, speaking in both English and Spanish. She talked about the Richard she'd first met 54 years earlier, brilliant but cold, focused entirely on accumulation and success, treating people as either assets or obstacles. And she talked about the Richard who died yesterday, kind and humble and genuinely interested in people's lives, using his gifts to serve rather than to dominate. She cried as she spoke, mourning the loss of her closest friend, her partner in building something meaningful, the person who'd proven to her that compassion was never wasted, even when offered to someone who seemed completely lost. The Santos Foundation continued after Richard's death. Maria ran it for 7 more years, eventually stepping down at 86 when her health made it difficult to maintain her active schedule. The foundation's board, carefully chosen to represent the communities they served, continued the work Richard and Maria had started together. Richard's will left his remaining wealth, about $2.3 million, to the foundation. But more importantly, he left detailed documentation of their methods, their philosophy, their approach to serving communities with genuine respect and partnership rather than imported assumptions. This documentation became a resource used by dozens of other foundations and nonprofits, spreading the impact far beyond what Richard and Maria could have achieved alone. Maria lived 7 years after Richard's death, dying peacefully at 93, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. At her funeral, dozens of people spoke about her kindness, her wisdom, her ability to see people's humanity when they couldn't see it themselves. Several people who'd been helped by the Santos Foundation spoke about meeting Maria, about how she'd treated them with dignity and respect, how she'd made them feel valued and seen. One woman said, "Maria Santos taught me that I mattered, that my struggles mattered, that I deserved help, not because I'd earned it, but because I was human. That changed my life." This is their complete story, the story of Richard Morrison, who lost a fortune, and found a life worth living. The story of Maria Santos, who showed compassion to someone who didn't deserve it and changed the trajectory of thousands of lives through that single choice. A story about redemption earned through genuine transformation. A story about friendship that transcended every social boundary. A story about discovering that real wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with human connection. If this story has touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories about extraordinary, ordinary people, and let us know in the comments which moment moved you most. Tell someone about Richard and Maria. Let their story remind us all that the people we overlook might be the ones who save us. That kindness is never wasted even when offered to someone who seems unworthy. That everyone is capable of profound change if they're brave enough to acknowledge their failures and humble enough to accept help. That real transformation happens not through grand gestures, but through consistent daily choices to see and honor other people's humanity. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for believing in second chances and the possibility that broken people can help each other heal. Until next time, remember, you're never too lost to find your way home, never too broken to be worthy of love. And sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you've been overlooking all along. True wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch, the people we help, and the love we share. That's what lasts. That's what matters. That's what makes a life truly rich. The legacy of Richard Morrison and Maria Santos extended far beyond the specific individuals they helped through the Santos Foundation. Their story became a case study used in business schools across the country. Not about how to build wealth, but about the difference between success and significance, between accumulating power and creating actual value in the world. Professors used their example to challenge students to think deeply about what they were really pursuing in their careers and whether professional achievement would actually lead to the fulfilling life they imagined. The story was taught in social work programs as an example of how compassion can catalyze profound transformation, how meeting people where they are with genuine respect and care can create possibilities no intervention program could manufacture. Social work students analyzed Maria's approach, how she didn't try to fix Richard but simply showed up consistently, how she created space for him to discover his own capacity for change, how she balanced clear boundaries with genuine friendship. Their story was referenced in sermons and spiritual talks across many faith traditions as illustration of core theological principles, that grace is unearned, that redemption is always possible, that we're called to show compassion, especially to those who seem least deserving, that human worth is inherent rather than achieved. Pastors and rabbis and imams told their story to congregations struggling to understand what it truly meant to love your neighbor or show mercy or practice forgiveness in concrete daily reality rather than abstract principle. But perhaps most importantly, their story inspired countless ordinary people to reconsider how they treated service workers in their own lives. The viral article and subsequent media coverage sparked national conversation about the invisibility of people in low-wage service jobs, the casual dehumanization built into how wealthy people interacted with those who cleaned their homes or delivered their food or maintained their buildings. Thousands of people read about Richard treating Maria as invisible for 15 years and recognized themselves in that behavior, recognized how they'd been doing the same thing to real human beings in their own lives. Some of these people actually changed. They learned the names of people who cleaned their offices. They asked genuine questions about the lives of people who delivered their packages. They offered authentic kindness to people whose labor they'd previously taken for granted. Not everyone, of course. Most people read the story, felt momentarily moved, then returned to their normal patterns. But some people genuinely changed how they saw and treated others, and those small individual changes rippled outward in ways that couldn't be measured but mattered enormously to the specific humans who experienced them. Maria herself was often asked in interviews how it felt to have her private act of compassion become this public story that millions of people knew about. She was always humble in her responses, uncomfortable with being portrayed as exceptionally virtuous. "What I did wasn't extraordinary," she would say. "It was just basic human decency. Someone was suffering, and I had the ability to help. That's what we should all do for each other. I don't think I deserve special recognition for doing what should be normal. What deserves recognition is Richard's courage to actually change, to face who he'd been and choose to become someone completely different. That's the hard part. That's the remarkable part. Anyone can show kindness once. Richard chose to become a kind person, to fundamentally transform his values and his way of being in the world. That took real courage and real work." Richard Alley, in his own interviews, always redirected attention to systemic issues rather than his personal redemption narrative. "The real story here isn't about me becoming a better person," he would say. "The real story is about how our society makes people invisible based on their job or their income or their social position. The real story is about millions of Maria Santoses who work incredibly hard serving others while being completely overlooked and undervalued. The real story is about the medical debt crisis that pushes families into bankruptcy. The real story is about immigration systems designed to be incomprehensible. I had one extremely fortunate thing happen. Someone showed me compassion when I hit bottom. But millions of people hit bottom every year, and no one shows up to help them. That's what we should be talking about. Not my personal journey, but the systemic failures that create so much unnecessary suffering." The documentary that was eventually made about Richard and Maria's story, released 5 years after the Times article, tried to maintain this balance. Yes, it told their personal narrative in detail, Richard's rise and fall, Maria's decades of invisible labor, their unlikely friendship, the foundation they built together, but it also dedicated significant time to exploring the broader context. Interviews with other cleaning workers about their experiences of invisibility, analysis of wealth inequality and its psychological effects, examination of medical debt and immigration systems, profiles of other Santos Foundation clients whose lives had been changed. The filmmakers wanted viewers to see Richard and Maria's story not as a heartwarming exception, but as an example of what becomes possible when we choose to actually see and value all humans, regardless of their position in social hierarchies. The documentary won several awards and was watched by millions. It sparked more conversations, inspired more foundations to adopt similar approaches, led to policy discussions about medical debt reform and immigration system improvement. Richard and Maria participated in promotional interviews, but always tried to direct attention beyond themselves to the issues and the people the foundation served. Through all of this, they remained remarkably unchanged by fame. They still lived simply. Maria stayed in her modest apartment in Queens, even though she could have afforded something much nicer from her foundation salary. Richard stayed in his small 2-bedroom, even though his careful management of his remaining wealth meant he could have upgraded significantly. They both felt that maintaining simple lifestyles kept them grounded, kept them connected to the communities they served, prevented the kind of separation and superiority that wealth often created. They celebrated small moments together, birthday dinners at their favorite Salvadoran restaurant, quiet evenings watching old movies in one of their apartments, Saturday mornings at the food bank, working side by side to serve families, Sunday services at church where they'd become beloved community members. These simple rituals of friendship and service brought them more genuine joy than anything Richard had experienced during his years of wealth and power. One evening, about 15 years after they'd started the Santos Foundation, Maria and Richard were having dinner together when she said thoughtfully, "You know what amazes me, Richard? How much richer both our lives became when we stopped focusing on ourselves and started focusing on serving others. I spent 37 years cleaning houses, which could have felt like wasted time doing work that didn't matter. But I chose to see it as serving families, helping them have beautiful homes, being the reliable person they could count on. That choice made the work meaningful. And you spent 23 years now serving our community instead of accumulating more wealth. These have been your best years, haven't they? Yes, Richard said without hesitation, without question, my best years. The happiest, the most meaningful, the most fully alive I've ever felt. When I was a billionaire, I was actually very poor. I had money, but I had nothing else that mattered. No real relationships, no purpose beyond accumulation, no connection to anything larger than my own ego. Now I have actual wealth. I have you, this incredible friendship that's the greatest gift of my life. I have community where I belong and matter. I have purpose in work that genuinely helps people. I have the satisfaction of seeing direct positive impact from my efforts. I'm rich now in ways I never was before, and it has nothing to do with money in the bank. Maria smiled. That's what I've tried to teach you all along. That real wealth is measured in love and connection and purpose and service. You finally learned it. You're a good teacher, Richard said warmly. A patient teacher. It took me a while, but I got there eventually. Better late than never, Maria said. And you've got many years left to keep practicing these lessons, to keep getting better at being human. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while. Two people whose lives had intersected in the most unlikely way and created something beautiful from that intersection. A friendship that transcended every social boundary. A partnership that had helped thousands of families. A story that would inspire countless others long after they were both gone.